How's everybody doing today? So this is going to be the last governor's race that we cover here for the 2018 midterm elections. I might do a couple of House of Representatives races after this. Most likely we're going to go back to covering more specific political issues and news and things like that. Stuff more in line with the last two videos that I put up on this channel. But today, we're going to be covering the Georgia gubernatorial race. And I almost didn't cover this race. I have kept my coverage solely to races that are generally considered to be toss-ups. This one is kind of split. About half of reporting sites and political sites rate this race as a toss-up. The other half rate it as lean Republican. This race is going to be between Georgia's Secretary of State, Brian Kemp, the Republican candidate, and his Democratic challenger, Stacey Abrams, who is the former House Minority Leader for the state of Georgia. Now, it's pretty clear when we go ahead and look at the polls exactly why it is that some sites do rate this race as lean Republican. Because while nobody is showing Kemp with a massive lead, he is consistently shown with a lead. And it is pretty consistently a 2-point lead, even if we go back into the older polls, which I didn't use here. The current polls, Survey USA, the Atlanta Journal, and Landmark Communications polls all show Kemp ahead by a margin of exactly 2 points. I did find in the older polls that are kind of outside the scope of what I normally use, 2 polls that did show Abrams being ahead, one by Gravis and one by Mason-Dixon. However, in order to get the latest polls showing her in the lead, we have to go back to July, and then prior to that, February. So discussing the 2 candidates here, let's look at Stacey Abrams first. We have talked about her in the past, more specifically the fact that she is progressive, and also on a separate note I had mentioned that she was one of the few candidates out there who is reporting herself with a negative net worth. In other words, she is in debt. I have mixed opinions about that as far as her viability as a candidate. Some people might view that as making her one of them, one of the people. I think a lot of people, especially those who are more interested in politics and stuff, might take that as a concerning sign that perhaps maybe she wouldn't be the person you would want to run the state's finances. As I said, she was former minority leader of the Georgia House of Representatives. It is also of note that she is the first black female major party gubernatorial nominee in the United States. Tell me that's not a mouthful to say. She is, aside from her political career, also a writer. She has written articles on economics and politics, as well as romance novels. She has very traditional, like Sanders progressive type platform policies and beliefs. One of her notable positions in the past was on prison reform. Now, Brian Kemp is also a fairly regular face in Georgia politics. As I said, he is the current Secretary of State of Georgia. He has also had past failed runs at the gubernatorial election, as well as being a former senator of Georgia. Mr. Kemp has held the office of Secretary of State of Georgia for 8 years now, since 2010. He is a pretty down-the-middle conservative, nothing too out of the ordinary. Now, there is one kind of burgeoning story that I do want to talk about before we get into kind of the rundown and closing here. Several civil rights organizations have moved to sue Brian Kemp in his capacity as Georgia Secretary of State. Now, this is because the Georgia Secretary of State has a few responsibilities pertaining to overseeing elections and voter registration. First, let me explain what the suit is about. there is an issue with a law that is being enforced by Mr. Kemp, wherein a large amount of people attempting to register to vote, reportedly 80% of which are minorities, are being blocked because of a regulation that stops voter registrations from going through if there is any sort of discrepancies and stuff with public documentation, identification, things like that. Now, this can be as specific as a missing or extra space on a record, a missing hyphen on a record, etc., etc., etc. Now, in the latter case, I can tell you that from personal experience, that is an issue with specifically Hispanic voters. There seems to be a problem where the United States government, in a lot of cases, can't figure out how hyphenated names work. In my girlfriend's case, one of her IDs has both of her last names written as one solid last name. I remember in particular having a conversation with one of my exes about her IDs, which she had a hyphenated name on there, but was bothered by the fact that out of her entire family, hers was the only ID where they put both of her last names and everybody else just got one. So it seems like in a lot of cases, people making identifications and stuff for Hispanic individuals don't seem to understand quite how hyphenated names work. And I imagine that it can get even more confusing for some married Hispanic women when they start to introduce the "de" in the name. They probably mess that up a lot as well. Nevertheless, however, I do think that this is a pretty clear tactic to try and influence the outcome of the election, and I think this for a couple of reasons. First off, the suit has been leveled directly at Secretary of State Brian Kemp, and certain left-leaning media organizations, including CNN, have released articles talking about his conflict of interest, etc. However, literally what he is doing is fulfilling his office that he was elected to fulfill. He did not make this law. As a matter of fact, this law was passed by the Georgia General Assembly in 2017, so if anybody had any hand in making this law, it was in fact his opponent, Stacey Abrams, who at the time would have been a member of said General Assembly, as a matter of fact, depending on what time of year it occurred, perhaps even the House Minority Leader. Brian Kemp literally had no say in the creation of this law. All he is doing is, he has a job which is to enforce whatever laws the Assembly and the governor, etc. make, and he's doing his job. I think that it's pretty clear that these people know this. Suing the office of the Secretary of State may be a legal necessity, but certainly CNN would know better than to call it a conflict of interest on his part. As a matter of fact, if anything, it would be a little bit of a conflict of interest if he stopped enforcing the laws to the letter while he was running for office. But I think that the hope would be, aside from the fact that they can have news stories run questioning the integrity of Brian Kemp by bringing this lawsuit, additionally, were there by some freak chance to be a judge issuing such an order, it could perhaps give a boost to Democratic voters right before the election. So, last thing to talk about here, Georgia voter demographics, pretty solidly red. Georgia is kind of what I would call almost a red stronghold state. However, there was some small cause for hope in this election going into the campaigns because of the results of the 2017 special election that occurred in Alabama, wherein Democrats were able to flip a seat in the United States Senate in what is also a very strong red state right next to Georgia. At the end of the day, I'm going to say that this race is a 75% advantage for Kemp. I think there's a 75% chance he comes away the governor of Georgia after this election. Again, I don't think that this was necessarily really even a toss-up race. I think that typically I wouldn't have covered it, except for it was the last one on my list, and also there was that interesting bit of kind of developing information about the voter registration suit that I did want to talk about real briefly. Guys, don't forget to like and subscribe. This channel's been doing really good lately for subscriptions and for increases in views, really poorly for engagement. Not a lot of comments, not a lot of likes or dislikes. So, you guys have a great night. I'll see you in the next video, and peace.